Welcome back to season 4 of Nothing Is Real. We've got a couple of things lined up for this season, don't we, Stephen?
One or two.
And we're going to continue with what seasons 2 and 3 brought us, which is a couple of deep dives where we kind of go a little bit longer than anyone thought possible on certain topics.
Yes, mostly George topics. We're just going to do 10 episodes on George Harrison albums.
Yeah, we figure there's a couple of things about All Things Must Pass that were left unsaid. And of course, the big 5-parter on Give My Regards to Broad Street. But no, we plan on doing more and of the same and beyond, basically. And beyond, with a few extra bits and pieces out there. So thank you for listening to everything so far, and let's get stuck in. Welcome to Nothing Is Real, a podcast about the Beatles. Everybody thinks they know the Beatles, but how much do we really know? My name's Jason Carty.
My name's Stephen Cockcroft.
And we're live on tape from Dublin and Belfast. On Sunday, February the 9th, 1964, the Beatles took to the stage of the Studio 50 building on Broadway and West 54th Street in Manhattan as the headline, bill-topping guest stars of that week's edition of the Ed Sullivan Show. And it was the culmination of an unimaginable series of events for a band that only played their last show at the Cavern about 6 months earlier. The Beatles were number 1 in the US charts that night with I Wanna Hold Your Hand, but if that song was the fuse, then their Ed Sullivan appearance was the full explosion, an all-encompassing pop culture moment. And the legend of that performance on that night has grown over the years, in no part cultivated by the Beatles themselves. But what's the truth? What's the legend? How did it all come to pass? And how come no one ever talks about all their other Ed Sullivan appearances, especially the one 18 months later in August 1965? There is a lot to talk about here, isn't there?
There is a lot to talk about, and I know you're looking forward to this, being a connoisseur of American talk shows and talent shows and variety programs, and really all-round man from the 50s.
I have an unusual, along with the Beatles reservoir of arcade facts. Yes, American television and late night television is also a
specialist subject.
Yeah, but it's. I do wonder, when we're thinking about, talking about Ed Sullivan in the year that we're doing this, 2021, do we think of Ed Sullivan in 2021 because of the Beatles? Maybe that's a European, this side of the Atlantic perspective, but,
I think so. I mean, I don't think Ed Sullivan would have been known in England, in the UK, Europe. His show ran in the 60s, early 70s. I don't recall his name coming up other than in the context of the Beatles appearing.
Yeah, and it's, I know he was a cultural institution, as you say, in the US, so there's a generation of people who grew up with him. But for the people who didn't grow up with him and the people who weren't living in the US, I think nowadays you mention Ed Sullivan and you think of the Beatles, and that's been something that's been celebrated, and we'll talk about the celebrations of that performance a little bit later on. And it's also, there was a handful of shows at the time that were being pulled from North America onto British screens. There was television started in Ireland in 1962, but obviously it had been running on the BBC for a long, long time before that. But the only real show I could think of as a comparison is something like Phil Silvers. Like, he became a name TV show in the UK, but other shows that were happening at the time, like Jack Benny and all the rest, they weren't landing at all over in the UK.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I know of them just because of a sort of cultural significance in the States. Shows like The Honeymooners and things like that. They sort of bleed through a little bit. But the other thing you have to remember is this is a time, I suppose, when there is one big show for this, one big show for that. There's a talk show, there's a variety show. There's a limited number of these shows going out. And it's not like now where you have a trillion television channels and, we could have a TV show if we wanted.
We could go on Twitch and do this. And actually, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, as a kid, the first time anything Ed Sullivan hit my consciousness was that Billy Joel video. Remember that one?
No.
He did it. the video.
Why would I remember? Why have I
already veered off into the world of Billy Joel? He did a 1983 video for Tell Her About It, and the it's a fake Ed Sullivan Show appearance with an Ed Sullivan impersonator. And I think as a kid,
of course it is.
As a kid, I didn't really understand what the reference was, but but it's that kind of cultural landscape that Ed Sullivan managed to imprint himself on, I think, because of the Beatles appearance. So let's cover all bases here. Let's go all the way back. Who was Ed Sullivan, Stephen?
Who was Ed Sullivan? I could read this in the style of Ed Sullivan, which would be,
because we want to be kind of comforting and entertaining.
Yeah, he'd zero personality, very stilted delivery. What people say about us, me, yeah, he's at this variety program, the Ed Sullivan Show, which was originally called The Toast of the Town.
Nice.
That's a great name. So it ran for 23 years from 1948 to 1971 and is the longest running variety show in US broadcast history. And we've never heard of it, except in the context of the Beatles. So he now has a theatre named after him.
Yes.
So the original location, or the second location, Studio 50, Broadway, is now the Ed Sullivan Theatre. And do you want to tell us about you've been to the Ed Sullivan?
I've been to the Ed Sullivan Theatre. I went to, over the years, I went to 3 separate David Letterman recordings. So I think the second thing that Ed Sullivan is in our consciousness these days is because he does have the Ed Sullivan Theatre, which is a very striking building on Broadway near 7th Avenue in the US. And it's a curious building because it opened in 1927 originally as a kind of a Hammerstein theatre, which went bankrupt, although one of the first people to tread the boards was Cary Grant, which is a interesting fact. And then it became a music hall theatre. But then in the mid-30s, CBS took over a lease, the CBS Broadcasting Company of the States, and it was a radio theatre initially, similar to a few blocks over the NBC theaters or studios in Rockefeller Center were originally radio studios. And it isn't until about 1950 when it gets fitted out for television. And even then, it's not Ed Sullivan's exclusive theatre. It's Jackie Gleason who's using it before Ed Sullivan moves across. He's at another CBS facility for the first few years of the Toast of the Town. And the theatre only gets renamed the Ed Sullivan Theatre at the end of December 67, which is to celebrate his 20th season on the air. And the Beatles actually send him a telegram to celebrate that. But it was just kind of a multifunctional kind of theatre space. There was all sorts of TV shows like the Andy Griffin Show and game shows and everything being recorded there in the 60s. But it is a curious building. It's like many things that you see on television, it's kind of smaller than you think. And, the building is now, used for the Late Show with Stephen Colbert. But yeah, it is quite small. And there's only a couple of hundred people who were in the room for the Beatles performance at the time.
And did you feel the history? Did you feel the hand of history on your shoulder there when you were there? Or is there no sense of...
Once you're in it and you've seen it, there are certain kind of traits to the building. There's some arches up in the balcony and things. And then when you see them, they are familiar. And rewatching the shows, the Ed Sullivan shows for this, there are certain cutaways where they're in the audience and they're in the crowd, and you can definitely see, oh yeah, that's the exact same building that Letterman and Colbert have been using for the last almost 30 years. So it is nice to be there. But
so what we're saying is the building has more personality than Ed Sullivan.
That's quite true, and he's certainly, he's a bit of a building of a human, quite functional.
This is one of the things that you were saying we were watching the shows. I mean, I actually watched the entire show that the Beatles were on each time they appeared, and those shows are really quite something. I mean, I don't think even. It must be a peculiarly American thing. I've seen early 60s variety shows from, the UK, from the BBC, and they're a completely different thing. In the UK, everything is kind of hinged on the personality of the presenter.
Well, there are two similar things that, like the big UK show at the time was Sunday Night at the Palladium.
Yeah.
And that's actually, I know we've talked before about Talking Pictures TV, the TV station over here, but they're repeating those shows on a Sunday night at the minute. And, the TV variety shows in the UK and the US were essentially rollovers from the music hall
stage,
in the States, and kind of the end of the pier kind of vaudeville stuff in the UK. They're kind of manifestations of those on stage versions. I think what's striking about the American ones that would have been unusual to audiences at the time in the UK was the amount of advertising and inserts and commercial references, which wasn't really a thing. But in fairness to Sullivan, he, for all his kind of stiltedness and odd delivery, people did love him, and he did have a knack for getting people onto his show and for spotting things and for identifying what would work.
I think that's right. He's a presenter rather than a performer. So he's not really telling jokes. He's not got a stage pattern. He's a presenter, almost like a sort of impresario behind the scenes is really where he might have been in the old days. But he certainly had a talent. And had a reputation for spotting and promoting talent, and also quite almost unique for the time is this idea. He was a great champion of black artists that he had on the show at the time, and he made a great point of saying, I never ask anyone about religion, race, politics. It's about talent, and that's. How you get on my show is talent and nothing else. And so it's obviously the big show. If anyone's wanting to break through into the States at the time, that's the show to be on. And, the shows that the Beatles appear on, you do have a smattering of other UK performers. We see Morecambe and Wise and people like that. So this is the gateway.
Yeah. And it's interesting, he would pay for people to come on the show, which, you kind of look at the TV landscape nowadays and, TV appearances are generally seen as, it's the publicity. So it's a symbiotic relationship. Like, no big movie star or music star is being paid to go on, Jimmy Fallon or Jimmy Kimmel or any of those shows. They realize that it's part of the game that they plug in. But, even when the Beatles were involved, he would pay thousands of dollars to secure people onto the show. So he was, it's definitely not like that now.
So we can get Matt Damon or on the show. We can just give him a ring. We
might have to ask Kevin Godley for those thousands of euros back. I didn't realize that was part of the deal.
Yeah, it was. We made a mistake there.
Terrible mistake. So Ed Sullivan, he works his way up. He has this show from the late 40s. He puts his mark on it, and he's definitely a very distinctive presenter type figure. So how does it come to pass? Because when we look at the timeline, the Beatles are on the Ed Sullivan Show in February '64, and we talk about tearing apart the legend. I think one legend that we should probably flag up now is this notion that the Beatles themselves said, which was, "We're not going to America until we're at number one," which is total hokum.
Yes, and it's hokum that's being repeated, I think, by George in Anthology.
Yeah.
And whether he genuinely believes that or this is a rewriting of history, you sometimes get the sense that the Beatles, the individual Beatles themselves, don't know, and they sort of buy into the myth.
Yeah.
But certainly that was not. I think Paul is clear in Anthology that isn't the case. George is sort of clear. No, we had to have a number one. That's what we were going to do.
Yeah, so just as a reminder, obviously 63 is the year when they break through in England and Britain and in certain pockets of the world where Beatlemania takes hold. They cannot get a single out on the Capitol label in the US, and it comes to pass that the eventually I Want to Hold Your Hand hits and gets to number one in January when the Beatles are in Paris, and they find out they've number one, and then they go to the States. But the groundwork for them getting to the States is happening months in advance.
It's all happening. There's a sort of a 5-month period. There's a 5-month build up to this. So it's inconceivable to think that, the single hits number one in January and then 3 or 4 weeks later they're flying to the States.
Yeah.
That's just not possible.
Yeah, that Ed Sullivan has cleared the decks for the Beatles. That's not what happens.
That's not what happened. So it depends. You can take, there are a couple of different versions of this.
Well, first of all, Brian Epstein, you have to hand it to Brian Epstein. Yeah. And you kind of look at what we're about to unfold here. He's a great manager. He really is fighting for this band and making some really smart decisions.
I think that is what comes out. You know, there's a lot of criticism in terms of his financial dealings, but in terms of the if you like, the kind of old-fashioned hustling for your client, he's doing everything right here. And this goes back to sort of November 1963, arguably a little bit earlier. The story is supposedly that on 31st of October, the Beatles are flying back into London from their Swedish jaunt, and supposedly Ed Sullivan is passing through the airport at the same time. He sees the sort of the crowds, the Beatlemania going on, and this sort of piques his interest. Now, that is the stuff of legend, but I have not been able to find any confirmation that actually happened.
Yeah.
That he was there at that particular moment and experienced that. That seems to be the accepted truth, but I can't see any mention of him even talking about that. What we do know is that the first meeting that was set up between himself and Epstein took place in New York, and that took place on the 11th of November. And this was as part of a trip that Epstein was specifically making to New York. He and Billy J. Kramer were flying to New York, and the main point of that seems to have been Epstein was also Billy J. Kramer's manager, and he was trying to get him hooked up. He felt he was going to be a sort of a cabaret style artist. You know, he was going to be doing theater shows or Las Vegas, that type of performer. And that was the main purpose of that jaunt to New York.
So when we talk about Ed Sullivan and Brian Epstein, though, there are a couple of other people who plug into that story who are kind of important to flag at this point when we're kind of in October, November 63.
Yes. So regardless of whether or not Ed and the Beatles cross paths at the airport, we do know that there are a couple of key figures here. There's a guy called Jack Paar. He was the talent coordinator for Ed Sullivan, and he was regularly visiting Europe looking for talent. So that's another characteristic of the Ed Sullivan Show, is that he did feature European talent, European acts.
And they were they were all sorts. They were kind of magicians and puppeteers and all sorts of acts.
Yeah, just weird. It was a very strange mix. And in London, he was assisted by a chap called Peter Pritchard.
And he's the link to Epstein, isn't he?
He was a theatrical agent, and he knew Epstein personally. Now, again, I haven't been able to find a date for this, but supposedly at least once in the summer of 1963, Peter Pritchard took Jack Paar to see a Beatles concert. I would be really interested to know where that was, what the set list was, what exactly he was listening to at the time, because neither of them at that stage seemed to have been considering the Beatles for the Ed Sullivan Show.
But at the same time, there wasn't a huge list of British groups who went over to America and became as big as an American group. I know the Telstar had gotten to number one as the first British group by Joe Meek's Tornadoes. But yeah, there wasn't. Ackerbilk, yes, another Ed Sullivan staple.
Well, we always say "Stranger on the Floor." That
was his big hit. But I guess you could understand if Peter Pritchard is bringing Jack Paar to see the Beatles, there isn't a context to this is the next big British band that are going to break through in the States. So it's I guess in some ways he's probably it's an experience that just goes into Bab's Rolodex, so to speak, that it might land later.
Yes, I mean, there's no sense that as early as the summer of 63 that this is on the cards. But Pritchard knows that Epstein is going to New York, and say the main thing is pitching Billy J. Kramer, but also Epstein, I think, is wanting to find out why America is not falling for the Beatles. What is going on here? Why will Capitol not release the singles? And Pritchard actually suggests to him at this stage, you should try and do a deal to get the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. And he offers to sort of be the intermediary. But Epstein, and again, this is, I think the confidence that he has in himself, he says, no, if we're going to do this, I'd like to do the negotiation. So rather than use an intermediary, he is going to pitch the the band to Ed Sullivan himself, and Pritchard says, well, that's fine. I'll set up a meeting with you and Ed Sullivan. And again, I think that's clever because Epstein is passionate about the band, and you think a face-to-face meeting with Sullivan is where he's going to be able to get that across.
Well, I think Epstein wants to be in the room, so it's going to be very easy if he's not in the room for the band to be ignored or to be bumped down the list or to not really understand what's going on. So Pritchard pushes Brian Epstein towards Ed Sullivan, and Ed Sullivan knows about the Royal Variety Show performance, doesn't he?
Yes, Pritchard has given Sullivan a report. That show took place on the 4th of November, 1963, and Pritchard off the back of that. And I suppose that makes sense because what you're seeing there is the Beatles dropped into that traditional showbiz variety performance style event. So Pritchard gives a report on that to Sullivan, recommends them, and sets up an appointment, which according to Epstein's appointment book is on the 11th of November in New York. And that initial meeting is just Epstein and Sullivan.
And it is worth pointing out, obviously, the Royal Variety Show, the famous Rattle Your Jewellery performance, is not only huge in terms of eyeballs watching television sets, but it's also huge in terms of the amount of newsprint and media coverage that gets set off in the days after that. So undoubtedly, Pritchard is probably talking about the performance, but he's also talking about the media impact and the after effect, the phenomenon.
Yes, the reaction. This is really, I suppose, where the Beatles are on everybody's radar. Every morning paper, in those days, people are reading their paper over breakfast, and the headlines are the Beatles, as well as it appearing on TV.
So assuming he's getting this report from Pritchard and, this passage through Heathrow Airport happened on October the 31st. Ed Sullivan obviously has an idea of what's happening, although apparently he can never remember names and things. Ed Sullivan, that's the legend. But as you said, there's a meeting that we know happened between Ed Sullivan and Brian Epstein on Monday, the 11th of November, 1963, and that's just the two of them meeting in a New York hotel.
That seems to be just the two of them, and it comes together very quickly. They just agree that the Beatles are going to appear on his show on the 9th of February, and also then the following week on a special show that's going to be broadcast from Miami. And it just seems to have happened as quickly as that. There's a follow-up meeting the next day where they meet for dinner. They've got Sullivan's producer, who's actually his son-in-law, Bob Pratt, is there, and the deal is sort of finalized. And according to Pratt, when he was introduced to Epstein, Sullivan said, this is the guy that has a great pop group and are going to be really big. So by that stage, Sullivan is talking up the band, and it's all full steam ahead.
Yeah, and obviously we don't know exactly what kind of magic stories that Brian was spinning on behalf of the group, because there's a couple of other things that are happening in parallel. One of the reasons he's in New York is also to go talk to Capitol Records and to try and see why there isn't a single coming out. So whether he knows the details of I Want to Hold Your Hand when he's talking to Ed Sullivan or not, we don't really know. I think he's probably playing one against the other.
I think there's an element of that. Capitol, the famous Dave Dexter, is still knocking back the singles and saying, no, we don't want them. They're not going to play well in the American market. The other thing that's going on is that United Artists are in the background, and they're setting up the film.
Now, this is really curious because, again, trying to tear down the legend. The legend is that the Beatles couldn't get arrested in the USA in 1963, and it's only it's like somebody pressed a button on January the 1st, 64 to let them in. But, there's obviously some people paying attention. And if you go back and look at, trade papers from the time, Billboard trade papers from late 63, there's a couple of stories, particularly if you're tracking, they used to have the international charts at the back. If you're tracking those things, you can see that this band, the Beatles, are in number one everywhere,
Yes.
So, if you were worth your salt in the US music business or entertainment business, you should at least, as the second half of 63 rolled out, had an idea of who they were. So, there are people in the US who do see a way of making money and thinking that this band is the future. And as you say, United Artists, the Hard Day's Night deal is coming together. That's around October 63 as well.
Yes, this goes right back to October 63. So as you say, United Artists are clearly more attuned to what's happening than Capital are. United Artists see this band, they're big in the UK, they're charting in other countries in Europe, and they think, we can make some money here. We can make a film. They're not really, I think, so much interested in making money off the back of the film. What they're interested in is the soundtrack album. Yeah. And this is just going to be a quick, cheaply shot sort of exploitation movie. Get the film out, but get the soundtrack out. And they see they can make money off the soundtrack. So Epstein has already got this deal simmering away in the background. And you've got to think that comes into the mix whenever he's pitching this to Sullivan. My boys are
they'll be movie stars
they're
next
about
year.
To be there this time next year. They're going to be movie stars. We've got a deal in place with United Artists. So it everything that you sort of uncover about this and the lead up to Sullivan makes it even more inexplicable that Capital are not doing anything. With the actual sort of record side of it.
Yeah, it is interesting, as you say, that United Artists wanted an album more so than a movie, and they were willing to, throw money at a cheap movie, which would, cheap enough to recoup its costs in the UK, in order to get, to think that this band could potentially be big in the States. And so that is happening. So, Brian sees it on the horizon that this big future soundtrack album is going to be coming out in the States, no matter what. So even if Capital were still playing hard to get at that point, Brian can say, well, look, we could launch on Ed Sullivan, we can get the movie out 2 or 3 months later and get a single out from United Artists and do it that way. So that's another possible route he has to getting US success. So as you said, there's a deal done quite quickly, and Bob Precht, the producer and son-in-law, who gets kind of name-checked on Sullivan's show from time to time, I've noticed, as a kind of a jokey aside. They do this deal. And again, as I said earlier, it's odd that they used to pay to get people onto these performances. And the Beatles do get paid a decent salary for their performance. And the deal is it's not just one performance.
No. So Sullivan, does traditionally pays good money. I mean, I think he pays top dollar. That he has that reputation. So there's £10,000 for a single performance is not unheard of. Here he offers Brian £3,500 for each of 2 shows, and also agrees to pay their kind of travel and hotel bills and things. I would like to know what the hotel bill turns out to.
It's a nice hotel, the Plaza.
It's a nice hotel. But supposedly it's Brian that says, well, look, let's split 10,000 across 3 shows. But that's on the basis that they get top billing. It's Precht that suggests, well, look, there's 2 live programs. Let's do a third filmed insert. That's 3,500 for the live shows, 3,000 for the filmed insert. And there you have a deal. Epstein is very clear that, Sullivan agrees straight away that they can have top billing. I think, again, that's a little bit of finessing the legend.
The legend.
I don't think that is actually the case. If you look at some of the shows, particularly the Miami show, other people are higher up the bill. I know you want to talk at some length about Mitzi Gaynor, who's your childhood.
Well, just a side point on Mitzi Gaynor, who and we'll talk about the shows one by one in a sec, but she is she's still entertaining. She's still on the go. She headlines the second Beatles Ed Sullivan Show. She's 89 years of age, and a few weeks ago I just saw her, on Twitter. She's on Twitter getting her COVID jab. So it's nice that things go on.
Can we get her on the show?
I'm sure we could. Yes.
Do we have 10 grand? Do we have 10 grand to get her on the show?
Well, 10 grand is almost 80 grand in money these days, which is it's interesting that that's the amount of money that was being generated by the show that they could afford to pay that.
Well, yeah, and I mean, and they have dozens of acts coming on to the show, all of whom need paid. But I strongly suspect that, even if Sullivan is kind of going, yes, that's fine, you can have top billing, this is not set in stone, and this doesn't happen until much, much closer to showtime.
Yeah.
And again, these deals are in typical Epstein fashion, initially just being done on the basis of a handshake.
And that is kind of, Brian is a pretty honorable guy in that regard. So again, the legend is somewhere in between. Does he demand they're the headliners, or is it just obvious by the time that February 1964 rolls around, these guys have to be the headliners because they're just the headlining stars around the world? And so the deal is made, and that is the first time that the Beatles are seen on US TV. The end.
The end. Well, it is sometimes assumed that Sullivan is their first TV appearance, but it was their live debut. I think we can say that. But they'd been on TV lots of times before they actually appeared on Ed Sullivan. Do you want to take a trot through their previous appearances?
Well, their first sighting on US TV, I think we should talk about that first.
Okay.
But maybe we should talk about it after this break.
End of part 1. Intermission. End of intermission. Part 2.
Welcome back. Yeah, the Beatle trivia buffs often say that the first time they're seen is the Huntley-Brinkley report in November, but actually they're seen on US TV for the first time when?
They are. This is back to September of 1963. Yeah. So they're virtually unknown, but they are seen on Dick Clark's American Bandstand. So Dick Clark has a Rate a Record segment on his show, and he played 5 different records. There's lots of hip teenagers judging, saying whether they're good or bad. And one of the records that is played is "She Loves You," and this is the Swan single that has come out. He plays it. It scores 73 out of a possible 100. Came in third place, and then Dick Clark holds up a photograph of the Beatles to the camera with their kind of makes there's a little bit of a joke about the mop top haircut, and everybody laughs and kind of makes fun of them. So if someone asks you, your pub quiz question, when was the first time they were seen, a photograph was held up on by Dick Clark in September of 1963.
That is, and does history recall which record won Rate a Record that week? Do we know?
Oh, no. I should have looked that up.
That's the pub quiz question.
That's the pub quiz question.
But it's like, that's back in, as you say, September 63. So there are small, tiny little seeds of Beatledom being planted in the US early on. What the books often say is that the first time they're kind of reported on or seen in live film footage is in November 18th, 1963 on NBC's The Huntley-Brinkley Report. And we have the audio of this recorded. We don't actually have the true video, but you can listen to the audio of this report. It's a 4-minute long segment and it's on YouTube. But it's kind of a report that is reporting on the craze more so than them.
Yes, it's not so much about the band or the music. It's about the sort of phenomenon of screaming teenagers.
Yeah. But, it's also reported later on that same week, again on a news show, CBS CBS Morning News have a 5-minute segment on the Beatles as well. Yeah.
This is CBS Morning News, November the 22nd, 1963. Again, it's about the popularity aspect. It's about this sort of cultural phenomenon that is due to be re-aired the evening of the 22nd. But of course, that's the day of the JFK assassination. So everything comes to a halt. That segment is eventually re-aired on the 10th of December, 63 by Walter Cronkite. And supposedly after that airs, Sullivan rings Cronkite and says, what do you know about this band? And this is what you were saying earlier. He says, about those bugs or whatever they call themselves. So again, it's typical apparently that he, doesn't remember names. So apocryphally, perhaps, he's ringing Cronkite in December saying, tell me what you know.
Well, in an era these days of, media cross-platform synergy, this is kind of quite quaint. It's worth pointing out, just reminding again that, Ed Sullivan is a CBS TV broadcaster. So his show goes out on the CBS network. And at the time, Walter Cronkite was the main evening anchor of the CBS Evening News, which, went coast to coast. He's one of these most trusted voices in America type individuals. So, what you can kind of see happening almost between the segment first coming out on November the 22nd and getting repeated on December the 10th is there's maybe a slight reawakening that not only are this band kind of tipping forwards in popularity, but CBS needs to kind of, up the ante in terms of realizing that they actually have signed this band up for a big TV show.
Yes, there seems to be a sort of a dawning realization, particularly on the part of Sullivan. And again, you don't know how much of this is everyone who tries to reposition themselves at the center of the story or big up their role after it becomes clear how big the story actually is. So supposedly after the Huntley-Brinkley report, Sullivan says, this is the point at which I made up my mind that this is the same sort of mass hysteria as Elvis Presley. So he's saying, I met with Epstein early November. I knew by the 18th when I saw the Huntley-Brinkley report, this was going to be huge. This was going to be Elvis style hysteria. So again, whether that's true or not, other aspects of the story will indicate that perhaps, Sullivan was still not 100% on board until much, much closer to showtime.
So the Beatles, as we say, have been on a couple of different things. They've been on the CBS News, and Ed Sullivan is kind of recognizing this. And, on December the 13th, CBS issue a press release. They announced that the Beatles, wildly popular quartet of English recording stars, will make their first trip to the United States February the 7th for their American television debut on the Ed Sullivan Show, Sunday, February the 9th and 16th. So December 13th, they see which way the wind is blowing. They're starting to, it's publicity for the Beatles, but they also realize it's publicity for their own show. So it's worth reminding, I know we did a show in season 1 about I Want to Hold Your Hand, but it's worth reminding ourselves what's happening at this time with I Want to Hold Your Hand, because Brian's trips to America have secured a capital release for the single and a promotional budget.
Yes. I mean, we sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, but it's this idea that Capitol just still are not buying in. United Artists have bought in, CBS, Ed Sullivan have bought in, but Capitol are still not buying in. So,
and it's worth reminding ourselves that Capitol are owned by the UK parent company EMI.
Yes.
And even EMI cannot tell them to release the single, which seems crazy.
It's absolutely crazy. And again, it's fascinating and probably a whole episode in itself about how that comes about and how that turns around. But essentially, just by way of a little bit of background, this all seems to be down to Dave Dexter, who has been tasked by the Capitol president, Alan Livingstone, to sort of review these pitches that are coming in from EMI. So the first 2 singles have been released by other labels. So Capitol have turned this down. VJ in February 63 released Please Please Me. She Loves You, which is the Dick Clark single, is September 63. But then by the beginning of December, first week in December, the US press are picking up on this Beatlemania phenomenon in the UK. And that actually prompts Alan Livingstone, who's the president of Capitol, to actually get involved himself. He listens to I Want to Hold Your Hand, and he thinks there's something here. He has a conversation with Epstein, a call with Epstein, and confirms that Capitol are going to put the song out as a single. And again, we talk about Epstein's management here. He says, fine, but I want a $40,000 promotional budget. And weirdly, Livingston says yes. I mean, that's a phenomenal amount of money.
Yeah, it's about 350 grandish,
Yeah. So he is clearly bought into this. He talks about, I heard the song, and once I heard the song, but there's got to be an element of these things are feeding themselves. So it's the TV show, it's the United Artists deal. All of this is ramping up the pressure, because he also recounts the fact that he went home talked to his wife and said, "Oh, this is what I've done." Played her the song, and she hated it, and he suddenly thought, "What have I done?"
Yeah.
But he then goes on to make clear that they didn't have to spend the $40,000. They spent a fraction of the $40,000 dollar promotional budget because the thing started promoting itself once the Sullivan Show took off. But the single was then officially scheduled to be released on the 13th of January, which was going to sort of coincide with the run-up to the Sullivan shows.
Yeah.
And again, we maybe talk about this on another episode, but it's interesting that by the time that date rolls around, VJ are re-releasing Please Please Me. Capitol have got their lawyers all over it. They're trying to take VJ out of the picture for unpaid royalties. And it's the first big lawsuits of the Beatles' career are developing at this stage.
That's a whole podcast series in itself.
It's a series in itself, but it does seem to be that it's that first 2 weeks in December that all of this starts suddenly snowballing.
Yes. And there's lots of different things happening, and they're just all, snowballing into an avalanche is kind of what they're doing. Yeah. And the single is originally, as you say, pitched for mid-January. The desire for people to get it in their hands, it gets pulled back to December the 26th. And, the legend of Marsha Albert is one of those people who helps drive that.
Yes, I mean, we all sort of know about Ed Sullivan and Murray the K, but, arguably one of the single most important people in the sort of breaking of the Beatles in America is this girl, Marsha Albert. So we do 45 minutes on Marsha Albert.
Well, I think she gets a nod in our I Want to Hold Your Hand episode, but it's still a great story that she's 15 years old in Maryland?
Silver Spring, yeah.
Yeah, and she just loves the Beatles so much she gets a hand on the single, isn't that it?
Yeah, that's it. So what happens is she sees the CBS News report. Again, it's all back to that report. She writes a letter to her local station, WWDC, saying, why can't we have this music in America? The DJ, Carol James, who had also seen the TV segments, he has a friend who is air crew on BOAC. So he gets in touch and says, whenever you're coming back from London, can you bring me a copy of this song, I Want to Hold Your Hand? So he actually gets, possibly the first ever copy of the single to appear in America. 17th of December. So this is 1 week after the Walter Cronkite segment on the 10th, he brings Marsha Albert down to the station to introduce the song. So she gets to introduce the song on American radio for the first time. And according to him, the switchboard lights up and the whole place goes nuts. And people are saying, what is this? Where can I get it? And he adds it to his playlist, his regular playlist.
And then, in that week before Christmas, the song just goes into rotation on radio stations in Washington, Chicago, St. Louis. Capitol bring back the single released December 26th. There's, they've got 200,000 copies planned, and they realize that's not enough. And, the thing we need to remind ourselves is that, this song happens very, very quickly. It's a 3-week spurt from December 26th, where this song becomes the biggest selling single in Capitol history. It sells 1 million, goes to number 1 by mid-January 1964.
Yeah, and this is primarily because Marsha Albert gets in touch with the DJ and says, and what happens was he makes tapes of it and gives it to other people. And it's at one point Capitol are issuing cease and desist letters to him to stop this being played.
Which is quaint.
It's very quaint. But then they sort of realize this is taking on a life of its own.
Yes. So, by in that kind of window of time, between Walter Cronkite and the song getting to number 1, obviously the Ed Sullivan Show is, it's planned, it's written, it's in the stars. If anything, maybe Ed Sullivan would probably have wanted to get them on a few weeks earlier if that was possible, because everything is happening a few weeks earlier. But you have that January 1964 period where the Beatles are not in the US, but they are the biggest selling act in the US. They are the number 1 group on the charts. And so they're generating news stories. As I've said before, you go back and you look at those Billboard magazines from December 63 to January 64, and basically the Beatles just start taking over that magazine. They are breaking all sorts of records. And so people are hungry to get them onto the TV. They don't really want to wait until February the 9th and the Ed Sullivan Show. And, there's one TV show in January that causes a bit of trouble by putting the Beatles on air in the US.
Yes, this is the Jack Paar program.
Yes.
So you're a Jack Paar fan.
Well, I'm not a Jack Paar fan, but he's a very curious guy. So obviously the Tonight Show is the big named brand in US late night television. For 30 years it was Johnny Carson's show. It's currently Jimmy Fallon's show. But prior to Johnny Carson taking over in 1962 for 30 years, the host was this guy, Jack Paar, who was kind of a mercurial, some would say emotional type. He once stormed off the Tonight Show for 3 months because the censors took a joke off air about a water closet at WC, and he thought this was network censorship and he couldn't handle it. So he kind of had that, people like, oh, what's Jack Paar going to do next? As opposed to Johnny Carson's kind of laid back, you could just have him on in the background type vibe. So Jack Paar had hosted the Tonight Show, I think, for about, for the guts of 5 years, but had decided that, the Tonight Show back in that day was 5 nights a week, and it was 1 hour 45 in length per night. So you were doing 5 1 hour and 45-minute shows per night, which he felt was burnout. So NBC didn't want to lose him, and they gave him a weekly show called the Jack Paar Show, and they turned over the Tonight Show to Johnny Carson, which worked out well. So he had this show called the Jack Paar program, and he would show things from around the world and would have kind of an internationalist kind of view. But one of the things he did was he got the rights from the BBC for the Beatles at the Royal Variety Performance.
Yes. So this is the show that back in 4th of November, and the BBC gave him these, or sold him this footage, which is essentially She Loves You, that show, that song, plus cutaways of the sort of screaming fans. And he seems to have approached it in a slightly kind of humorous fashion, a bit like Dick Clark holding up that photograph and getting people to laugh at their haircuts. So he broadcast this, and he actually says his introduction is, I understand science is working on a cure for this. These guys have these crazy hairdos, and when they wiggle their heads and the hair goes, the girls go out of their minds. Does it bother you to realize that in a few years, these girls will vote, raise children, and even drive cars? So it's being presented in a kind of sarcastic fashion. But Sullivan finds out about this is going to happen. And of course, the big thing here is that Epstein has promised Sullivan the first and exclusive American television appearance of the Beatles. And now Jack Paar is about to show a live performance recorded in November.
Yes. And, Epstein tries to stop it, and they try and go through whatever, see can the BBC rescind its licensing and take it back. But Paar realizes he's the only guy on network television with a decent bit of footage to show of the Beatles on US TV in January 64. He's not giving it back.
He's not going to budge. And I mean, Epstein at one point says, we're never appearing, we're not going to do BBC Radio ever again. We'll cancel our BBC Radio appearances. And the BBC, by all accounts, did try very hard to stop this. I
think it's understandable. I mean, it's a very unusual time. It's very fraught. They want to make the big bang. They don't want to ruin the Ed Sullivan Show.
Yes, it's undermining that. And I mean, I think that the moral here is he should have had lawyers on board. There's never.
You're right. Lawyers solve everything.
There's never a problem to which the correct answer is not. We need more lawyers. I mean, I think but Sullivan is absolutely incensed by this, and he tells Pritchard, cancel the Beatles, just cancel it. Pritchard very sensibly decides to wait a few days, see if Sullivan calms down, doesn't get in touch, doesn't cancel. Sullivan eventually kind of cools off, and I think, again, because he realizes just what a hot property he's got here. And I suppose the other thing is you're saying, it's a different audience. The Jack Paar Show is a different audience to the Ed Sullivan Show, and Paar is he says himself he's not presenting this clip as entertainment so much as a kind of, Yeah,
he later said, I didn't know they were going to change the culture of the country with music. I thought they were funny. I brought them here as a joke. That's what Jack Paar says.
Yeah, it's a kind of sociological phenomenon as far as he's concerned. It's not entertainment.
I think it's worthwhile then saying at that point that, you know, you have to doff your cap to Ed Sullivan, who took them seriously, or if not taking them seriously, he took showbiz seriously. He you know, he was really, what Ed Sullivan was doing on his show was, you know, sincerely saying, here are different entertainers from around the world doing their thing. Me and my team have made a decision that they are best in class in some way, and we're going to put them on our show for an hour, and you can watch all these different acts. Ed Sullivan, you know, from the shows I've watched, he's never, you know, we can joke that he's kind of stilted and he's kind of got this kind of pseudo Richard Nixon type vibe coming off him, you know. Yes. But he's not mocking the acts. He realizes that the show is dependent on who he gets on the show. He kind of knows, I think, that people aren't watching for him in a way. Yeah. And, you know, so he's taking showbiz and the Beatles seriously. He's not doing a Jack Paar on this at all.
No. I think that's a fair comment. And as you say, for all that I'm kind of making fun of Ed Sullivan's delivery, he is putting entertainment out there, and it is a wide variety of stuff that he puts on the show.
So in the grand scheme of things, you know, this snowballing into an avalanche is that, you know, Capitol Records have this biggest selling single of all time. It's at number one. And, you know, the Beatles are on their way to New York City, and Capitol realized that, you know, they have to fill in the gaps between, you know, what Ed Sullivan and his show are doing and what they can do as a record label. Because, you know, one of the things you think that, you know, sometimes the legend is that, you know, the Ed Sullivan Show caused US Beatlemania, but US Beatlemania was happening. Ed Sullivan just, you know, blew it wide open. And, you know, you kind of, you know, a very logical question is, you know, well, Ed Sullivan didn't put 4,000 fans at the airport in New York.
Yes. I mean, I remember sort of for a long time, that was the big mystery to me, was if you know, how did they get a number one in America before they'd actually been to America? How was it that they got off the plane and there were 4,000 fans at the airport? This seems to have this is inexplicable. But you get the sense that because the record had taken off and kind of grown organically in those last couple of weeks in December, arguably the anticipation, the fact that the Beatles weren't available, was building that anticipation, and that allowed Capitol then to, you know, they published the itinerary. I mean, this is again you can't imagine any record company doing this now, saying, you know, the group will be here at this particular time if you all want to go down and kind of scream and
have a shout
and yell at them. So they actually published the itinerary.
Yes.
So they take off on the 7th of February. From Heathrow, Pan Am Flight 101, with 4,000 people at the airport to see them off. They land in New York, and there's 4,000 people, presumably different 4,000 people.
Wow, I never thought it might be the same 4,000 people. That'd be wild.
All on you know,
private
flights, private jets that got there slightly early. So they Capitol, I think, managed this quite well. They're clearly a little on the back foot initially, in that they have to bring forward the record release. But I think it's the absence of the Beatles in America for that
creates
4-week period, creates that build-up of anticipation.
Yeah, and so Capitol, you know, tell the New York radio stations to get everyone off to JFK to meet the Beatles. And you know, something we should probably talk about a sec, because part of the legend is that, you know, the assassination of JFK led to another type of vacuum where people wanted, you look at this timeline and it is remarkably close to the assassination on the 22nd of November. You know, 2 weeks later, the Cronkite clip is shown on the evening news. You know, the song is spreading like wildfire, and the airport is renamed JFK in those few weeks as well. You know, like when they first were on CBS News, the airport wasn't known as JFK. You know, it's been a tumultuous collection of weeks. It's kind of impossible to say whether, you know, what impact that event had, but it must have had some kind of impact.
It certainly. Cultural commentators at the time seemed to be pointing to this. And again, it's to do with the fact that, Kennedy was a youthful president. He was the future of the country. It was young people, and all of that had been taken away. And there was a sort of a depth of kind of national sorrow. Yeah. But particularly with younger people. Yeah. Who saw in some way their future having been taken away or their future having been compromised. That theory seems to wax and wane in popularity. There was a period where people saying, "Oh, that really doesn't have anything to do with it," and that's you're projecting something there. But there were cultural commentators at the time were saying this is exactly what's happening. It's people suddenly something new, something young, something optimistic that is replacing. Lyndon Johnson coming in as a president is a very different personality to Kennedy.
Absolutely. And it's a 10-week period from the awful events of November 22nd to the Beatles coming to New York. But as we've seen from recent history, a lot can change in 10 weeks. A lot of
10 weeks, and long time.
It is a long time. So the Beatles land at JFK, and there's famous footage of the Mails Brothers film of the first US visit of the Beatles kind of in their car on the way to the Plaza Hotel. And we could talk about that film for a full episode some other time, but it's very, they are, it really is an extraordinary culmination because they're listening to themselves on the radio. They, apart from George, they haven't been to the US before, and they are really enjoying themselves. It's nice. Early Beatlemania is so much fun because there's none of the jadedness yet. It's all a novelty and fun and joyous.
I think it's that the clip of them in the back of the car listening to themselves on little transistor radios with Murray the K going completely nuts. It's a scene that is parodied so well in the Ruddles movie, but it's just this absolutely, as you say, this kind of innocent excitement where they just it's hard to conceive of what that must be like, where you suddenly arrive in a country for the first time and there's thousands of people there to greet you and your records are being played on the radio.
Yep, and
every radio,
every radio station,
and then they're back in the hotel that evening watching Walter Cronkite talking about Beatlemania is here.
Well, again, it's that CBS television synergy again, where Walter Cronkite is reporting from the Plaza Hotel suite, and Cronkite states that the British invasion this time goes by the codename Beatlemania. D-Day has been common knowledge for months, and this was the day. And, worth reminding ourselves, it's roughly about 20 years since the actual D-Day. These things are all fresh in the memory. This is not ancient history just yet. So they land on the 7th of February, 1964, and they set foot in Studio 50, which is now known as the Ed Sullivan Theatre, on the 8th of February, 1964 for their first rehearsal. But we might press pause right there, folks, because we have covered a lot of ground and we haven't even gotten to talking about the shows themselves, because there's a lot to tear apart in those shows as well. So this is going to go into part 2 of the Ed Sullivan shows, but hopefully we have laid out the path as to how they got here. It really, like when you look at it, it really is an extraordinary sequence, isn't it?
It is. It's the speed at which it happens, and there's a sort of organic quality to it. These days, or at any point after this would be a meticulously planned assault on the charts or the American media, and there would be money thrown at it. But this seems to have been a genuinely organic sort of move towards the top of the charts.
Yeah, they could only plan so much, and they were lucky that the wind was blowing in a certain way on some parts of these events. Yeah. So it's just a great bit of history. But we shall go in depth into what happened next, because lots happens next on next week's episode of the pod. Again, thanks for listening, folks. We always say that we're available at the usual places on Twitter at BeatlesPod and the Nothing Is Real Facebook group, but we also now have a range of options for you to get inspired by Nothing Is Real. We've nothingisrealpod.com, our website, which has got lots of information in terms of all our old Spotify playlists, all the ways to get in touch with us, all the ways you can support and help us out here on the podcast as well. Nothingisrealpod.com, so check us out there. And but for now, my name's Jason Carty.
My name's Stephen Cockcroft.
And this has been Nothing Is Real. Thanks for listening.